소만도 사에 오시는 소만도 회장님 사에 손발이 좀 안 맞아가지고 제가 초청사를 하게 되어 있었는데 소개를 또 우리 디멘셔널에서 오신 분이 하게 되어 있는데 양해를 바랍니다. So, Dr. Morton, please excuse us for proceeding in Korean for the first part. 오늘 특별한 강행에 오심을 환영드리고요. 부산이 이제 2009년 금융중심지로 지정이 되고 10년이 흘렀습니다. 올해 10년째인데 미래 10년을 준비하는 그런 입장에서 머튼 교수님은 다셨을 최고의 초청 강연자입니다. 그래서 국정감사 때문에 오늘 이 자리에 오신 부영대학교 김영석 총장님 외에도 부산대학교 전환 총장님 그리고 부산시 유재수 경제부시장께서 오시게 되어 있었는데 갑작스럽게 요새 국감철이지 않습니까? 그래서 일정이 잡혀서 못 오시게 되었고요. 여러분 나눠드리는 그 책자에 초청사, 축사 이런 게 있습니다. 그래서 초청사를 제가 하는 것보다는 부산대학교 전환 총장님께서 사실 이 자리에 오시기 위해서 굉장히 공을 들여서 영문으로 축사를 마련하셨는데 저기 뒤에 보니까 부산대학교 김무성 경영대 학장님 오셨죠? 네, 오셨는데 사실은 부산대학교 총장님 축사는 부산대학교 경영대 학장님이 이걸 읽으셔야 되는데 그것도 안 하신다고 사연을 하셔가지고 보시다시피 제 이 올라오는데 다리가 불편하거든요. 그래서 그럼에 불구하고 제가 안 하시다 해서 제가 하게 되었으면 양지 바랍니다. It is my great pleasure to welcome you to the renowned scholar lecture to commemorate the Busan's 10th year of being a financial hub in the southern region of Korea. We are fortunate to have the support from many groups and people. I would like to thank BNK Financial Group, Korea Exchange, Korea Securities Depository, and Korea Asset Management Corporation for sponsoring this event. I also want to thank Financial Innovation Hub Forum, EUTEP, and the Global Financial Forum for organizing this event. In addition, I would like to thank PNU School of Business, PNU College of Economics and International Trade, Bugyeong National University, Korean Industrial Economic Association, Korean Association of Financial Engineering, Institute of Management Research of Busan National University for managing this event. Today, we are honored to have Professor Robert C.머튼 here to give a lecture. I want to take this opportunity to personally thank him on behalf of the university. As you know, Professor Morton is a distinguished professor of finance at MIT Sloan School, the John and Natty MacArthur University Professor Emeritus at Harvard University, and a recipient of the 1997 Nobel Prize in Economics for a new method to determine the price of derivatives. He is currently resident scientist at Dimensional Holdings Inc., where he is the creator of Target Retirement Solution, a global integrated retirement funding solution system. His research focuses on finance theory, including life cycle and retirement finance, optimal portfolio selection, capital asset pricing, and the pricing of derivative securities. Professor Morton will give a lecture on trust versus technological innovation in finance, and I sincerely hope you will enjoy his lecture. Thank you all for coming today. October 21st, 2019, Busan National University President 전호 황 교도. 감사합니다.
Yes? Good. All right. So we start, and I should tell you about my slides. I'm not a slide person. I'm not very skillful moving slides back and forth. The slides are for you. If you hear something this afternoon that you find of interest, then they're to remind you what it is that you thought was interesting when you look at them later. So that's what these slides are for. So I hope you all have copies and pick them up. My opening slide is it's a timeline from the 12th century of financial innovation. And I remind you, financial innovation is the means by which the financial system improves and changes, and in so doing, adds to society. So innovation is the process of improving the financial system. I also remind you that this is a place, Asia in general, is a place where GDP is growing. There's good news and bad news with that. The good news is obviously GDP is growing. Okay. The bad news is every country in Asia has to raise its financial system, has to improve it. A lot of work, big challenge, whether it's the retirement system part, the payment system part, the advice system part, all need to be upgraded to meet the opportunities created by growing GDP. Now, before I get into my formal remarks, let me point out, though, that with that challenge to rebuild all the financial systems comes great opportunity. Opportunity to use this expense and so forth to leapfrog into the future and to improve yourselves not only to the level of current best practice, but far beyond. So what I wanted to show you with this slide, which you probably can't see too well from up here, is the speed of innovation. You see from the thing, starting from bill of lading and double entry bookkeeping, that finance has been innovating for centuries. But what else do you see? The speed of innovation has gone much, much, much higher. So what took a year to do 5 years ago is going to be much shorter. So the process from this picture is not only are we having financial innovation continuously, but it's accelerating. And I use that to make some remarks about the process of designing and implementing innovation. It is very common practice when a large system, a retirement system or something has to be redesigned and done, either by government or the private sector, large corporations. They say, what is best practice? And they go out and look around the world for the best practice in those financials and put them all on a table and say, all right, let's look at how it all is being done and figure out how we should do it for us in the future. My remark to you to begin this afternoon is, best practice is not good enough. And to make my point, we're just here ourselves, right? So you won't. I'm going to share a little story with you. But I drive rather fast. So when I'm in my home state of Massachusetts and I'm on the turnpike, I'm driving my car and I'm looking in the rearview mirror to see if anybody might interfere with my travel because I'm going very fast. And I suddenly realized I've been driving my car at 30 meters a second, looking in the rearview mirror. Now, when does that work? Well, if what's behind me and what's in front of me is the same, it works. The mirror shows me the back, but that's also where I'm going. But what if there's a change in front of me? Then looking in the rearview mirror is a disaster. That's my metaphor for you with this picture. Only if you believe there's no change happening in finance is it a good model to say best practice, what's being done, good enough for the future. Does that look like no change? You here in the city, a financial innovation hub, do you see no change? Bad model of the world of finance. So best practice is not good enough, don't forget. approaches into the finance scheme. First of all, it's not new. It's not new. I had the good fortune to be involved in innovation and bringing computers and big data and mathematical models into the mainstream of practice over the last half century. So in that sense, nothing of course of the levels of speed we have now, but we've been doing fintech for a long time. That doesn't diminish its importance or impact, but it also means this is not something that we've never seen before. So we do know something about it, we have some experiences. My view of fintech is I'm very optimistic. I think by bringing the technology properly into the natural course of improving the financial systems here in Asia and around the world offers great opportunities to improve things for society. And I'm especially happy about it because I think the improvements will disproportionately go to those who are currently underserved financially. If you're fortunate enough, even a teacher like me, to be able to have access to the kind of payment system that I have in my office at MIT, probably fintech will not improve on materially for me. But if you're trying to get money from Hong Kong to the Philippines on a regular basis to support a family, fintech is going to mean a lot. It's going to bring those costs down and make it possible. And so I am very optimistic about the power and the opportunity for fintech to help make the world a better place. And it's an exciting thing to look at. And also, however, there will be disruptions. Excuse me. The disruptions will come, as often happens when you bring technology in a major way into a field, in that there'll be disruptions of providers, regulators, consumers, overseers, but there will also be great opportunities for all four. There will be jobs that are currently done that will no longer be done by people, they'll be done by machines. And that's something, not just in finance, but around all fields, we need to take seriously and address. But I do not subscribe to what I call sometimes the extreme Silicon Valley model that says, if you're under 60 and you're in finance, you better retrain because you're all going to be replaced by robots, AI, machines. I don't think is going to happen, and I'm not just telling you that to feel good or not. I'm going to show you why I believe that. And so the Silicon Valley story, I think, is one, it's possible, but I don't think it's, I want to give you today some alternatives. And the alternative is that in order for current practices to lead to displacement, will it actually replace the existing institutions? Will they all go away? Or it could go another way and actually enhance the current institutions. And I'm going to show you how. So they actually become technology by itself. I hold in my hand technology, Samsung, Galaxy, it's only an 8, but it could be a 10 or a 9, okay? Good technology, well-known technology. And inside this is a thing called OK Google. Now, if you don't know what OK Google is, I put my Galaxy phone on, and if I have any question I want to ask, I say, OK Google, and it says, listen, and then I ask it a question and it gives me an answer. Okay? Now don't worry, this is a hypothetical. But suppose I have a really bad knee, it's incredibly sore. And it's been bothering me a lot. And so finally I pick up my technology and I say, okay, Google, what do I do about my bad knee? And in 12 seconds it says, cut it off. Do you think I will do that? I will tell you, I won't do that. It told me, the technology told me, but I won't do it. But look, that's me. How about you? I can see almost all of you pretty well out there. Anybody, if they got that advice from that technology and would just follow it, put your hand up, please. If you can't see, there are no hands up. Now, some people say technology isn't trusted by everybody, but millennials trust it. The younger folks, this old folks, no. But I can see some millennials in this audience, and I don't see your hands up. What was the purpose of going through this little exercise? It was to say, by itself, technology is not trusted even by millennials. Millennials are more facile with technology. They use it easier, they're more quick. That doesn't mean they trust it. Now, that said, if you accept that they don't trust it by itself, first of all, let me tell you the reason, at least my reason why you can rationalize it. You know, maybe you said, maybe I should retrain myself. Maybe I should do what the machine tells me. I'll point out the following. All models, all machines, everything we do is a model. Models are incomplete. They're not a description of the complex world of reality. They're a model of some form, part of our reality. They're incomplete, and therefore they can fail. But furthermore, they don't grow out of the ground like a tomato. They're made by people. And there are good models, and less good models, and terrible models. I don't know what model was used in this technology that gave me that advice. Was it the best health surgeons, the best medical minds in the world that built this model? Or did it get someone take it off the internet and just put it in here as some kooky thing? And also beyond the model, what do models need to use? They need data. Do we know what data was used to give me my knowledge, my recommendation? Is it biased data, dirty data, no data? I don't know. Finally, what else? What was the motivation of the model builder? Why did they build the model they built? Was it to make my health better? To give me good advice for my knee? Or was it for a body parts company who wants to motivate getting a supply? So that advice may not be good advice for my health, but good for the body parts company. So without knowing those things, it's perfectly rational not to trust technology. Now, that doesn't mean technology can't be used. It does mean, however, in those situations where you don't have either transparency or easy verification, you have to have the trust asset. You have to have trust in order to have fintech technology actually implemented. And so that's what I wanted to discuss with you. I said, every model. By the way, this isn't just about economics or finance. This is true in physics, chemistry, and life sciences. Models are made by whoever's making them, by making abstractions from complex reality. What do I put in the model for a good model? What do I leave out? That's a judgment. I know of no AI system, artificial intelligence system, or any other type of a mechanical system or data scraping system that tells me how to set up, what abstractions to make for the model for a particular purpose. And there's no such thing as the best model, because it has to be the best model for what you're applying it to. Besides for option pricing. The best option pricing model is different depending what you're trying to do with it. If you're trying to solve as a high-frequency trader of options, probably the best model is what's called a stat-arc model, where you're doing things in micro or milliseconds, okay? Structural models do nothing. If you're doing something like convertible bonds or something, maybe one of the big banks' best proprietary model with all the bells and whistles of the modern times will be best. And if you're in accounting and you're trying to write a model for expensing compensatory employee stock options, actually it turns out the best model is a simple Black-Scholes model. So depending on what you're trying to do, what model, the model for the same thing is different. So there's no such thing as the model, okay? Blockchain doesn't grow out of ground. Blockchain is a model is built and implemented. And so all models, have this quality to them. And I call that the art of the science. And it's true as much in physics, chemistry, or life sciences as in economics. Watson and Crick made some assumptions in coming up with their model that eventually led to DNA. Linus Pauling, a two-time Nobel Prize winner, was competing with them. He obviously had a different model. One of them was a better set of abstractions than the other. That's the art of the science. And I think that's at the heart of why models by themselves are not self-proving or self-effacing. Okay, so with this as background, let me move forward. I hope you'll accept, at least for the next 45 minutes, that technology by itself, unless you can verify or say transparent, can be, won't be trusted. Now, whoops, I'm pushing too many buttons. So let's see, I've got to go back. All right, here we are. Now, to show you, in the case of financial advice, with one exception that I know of, namely what's called indexing. I know some of you are not necessarily in finance services. Index investing is where you passively put your money in, you're invested in a bunch of different securities, stocks, and so forth, where you hold each one of them in a fixed proportion, say roughly the size of its market value or something. There's some fixed rule that you just do. So you put 0.2% of this of your money in this stock. It's just a fixed rule. That can be made transparent because I can give you the rule and I can look at my portfolio and see if you're following the rule. Did you invest that way? That's transparent. I can also build a model of how I should get returns if you did what I told you, and I can track how your portfolio you're managing for me versus this model that I know what it is and see if there's deviation. So in indexing, you don't need trust because you have both transparency and or verification. Other than that, there's no way to make it transparent. There's too much judgment, there's too many things. It can't make non-index vesting transparent. So it's opaque. It's not a choice. What about verification? What about, as I mentioned, Kako Pay? That was also not transparent. Well, this is what I'm going to show you, and I need some help from the audience. Third row back. Usually I call them the first row, but that's too easy. Third row back, you can see who I'm pointing to. Yes, that's you. Okay. He's my financial advisor. Okay? I just hired him to manage my money. Question: how long would he have to manage my money before the results of my portfolio, you know, I watch how my portfolio goes, my results of my portfolio would be such that I could reach the conclusion that a statistically significant conclusion, scientifically based, an efficiently statistically significant conclusion that he's either a good manager or not. Now, when I say it that way, you can think of another area. When you do drug discovery and you do clinical trials, you see how the drug does. You set a standard of significance, statistical significance, that you have to do better than in order to have the drug approved. This is the same idea. In other words, significance means to a precision, no one knows for sure, but to a precision of probability that you are willing to say is significant. So you understand my question. How long would it take? Now, I picked a t-statistic of 2. If you don't know what that means, don't worry about it. It's basically, it's probably a 95%. That's a very low bar. You'll get no drug approved with a t-statistic of 2. No one would hire me in Busan to manage their money if my strategies was a t-statistic of 2. So you understand, I'm not putting a high bar on it. I've done the calculations for you. What would I need to have that I would know after 5 years of his managing my money? 5 years to get a statistically significant T. The answer, as you can see up there, given that he's had 10 years of experience, and it doesn't make much difference even if he had 30 years of experience, which wouldn't be very many have that long a track record, he would have to earn me 37% a year for the next 5 years. Not 37% per year for 5 years. Or he would have to lose me 7% a year for the next 5 years. Now use your common sense. How likely do you think that at the end of 5 years I'll have a significant T? Not very high. 37% is not too common, and losing 7% a year 5 years in a row, on average, is not too common. That's my way of showing you the chances even in 5 years that I could reach that conclusion is very low, and it's much longer. This is my way of showing this is not like Kako play, where I try it works, she tries it works, you try it works, even before the end of this talk. 5 years, I won't know. Most likely. Now, there are ways to improve it. That's not the point. The point is, financial advice, investing, is very, very difficult to verify. By the way, if I had an AI machine, you know, no emotions, just looking at the things, it's going to use the same statistical calculations that I use. And it's going to get the same answer. It's going to tell you, sorry, as much as you'd like to know, the chances in 5 years you'll know whether he's significant or not are pretty low. Okay? So that's my way of getting across to you. In the world we are in, that financial advice is both opaque, non-transparent, and it's hard to verify. Therefore, financial advice requires trust, no choice. In fact, the only way he can be my advisor is if I trust him. Now, maybe I shouldn't trust him, but if I do, if he's my advisor, I have to trust him, or I wouldn't have given him the money. So however he did it, he convinced me to trust him. Keep that in mind. Okay? So now, I think I ought to give you some data. You know, we're talking about science, we have to have data. I think in 2008, 2009, I think you're aware there was a pretty big financial crisis. And in my country, at least, and elsewhere, trust was lost in a major way in the financial system. I don't think there's any doubt of it. In the retail area, that's us, people lost trust. I won't name which bank, but a very well-known bank in the United States, they found out 3 million bogus accounts, phony accounts established with their customers. Unacceptable. That's loss of being trustworthy. They were just bogus accounts that were used to charge and make money improperly. So that's a loss of trustworthiness by the provider. We also heard that the heads of many of the major institutions, not many, several of the institutions, didn't even understand the risks in their own institution. That's incompetence. So trust was lost on both lines. But the trust also was lost in the regulators. You heard of regulatory capture. What does that mean? That means the regulatory, instead of pursuing what they're supposed to do, looking after the parties they're supposed to, they had other agendas. That's a loss of trustworthiness. And then it was said that the regulators did not have the resources or the knowledge to properly oversee many of the risks of who were in responsibility. That's incompetence. So I think there's no doubt that there was a loss. Now let me show you some data to support this. This is the survey done last year by the CFA Institute. And they broke it between two kinds of investors. Retail investors, that's us, and institutional investors. Korea Investment Corp. That's an institutional investor. Okay? On the issue of fees, disclosure, and costs, which were rated very important, retail was very unsatisfied. Look at the satisfaction. If you want a comparison, same picture, same period, institutional investors were pretty satisfied, much more so. So retail, different from institutional in terms of their assessment of satisfaction. On the second one, they talked about returns, that the returns they were earning from advice, were they at least as good as indexing, benchmarks, or better? Good performance. Remember I was saying how we would figure out whether you're a good manager for me. Okay? Retail, very important. Satisfaction, very poor. Institutional, satisfaction high. So we have from those surveys evidence that the retail part of the world was not happy with what they were getting. And then now let me show you some more data. This is pictures of the flow of net funds into ETFs, if you know what they are, and index funds. Remember I explained to you earlier, index funds are transparent. Index funds you don't have to trust. Right? I went through that with you. Okay? Because you can verify and because it's transparent. The upper colors is the amount of money flowing into it each year cumulatively. And you'll see that it's nearly $1 trillion since the crisis have flowed in, this is just the United States, into indexing to ETFs. These are passive. Think of them as investments that don't require trust. Doesn't mean they're bad investments, they just don't require trust. What do you see on the bottom? That's the flow of money out of active investment funds, where people are using judgment. Whether or not it's a machine. When I say judgment, I don't mean just human judgment. I mean they're using all the technology that they can and everything else. They're actively managing the money. That's also about $1 trillion out. So that's a $2 trillion swing, minus $1 trillion in active to plus $1 trillion in passive. Very big swing. Question, and this is for some of the students. I know one student here, because I met her before, okay? If you're a student, maybe this would be a good research project for you. Here in Korea, or maybe there's 5 ways to do it. I'm showing you the data. I have a hypothesis, but maybe you want to test it, see if it works. Okay? So my hypothesis is this is the result of the loss of trust in the crisis by retail. When when you think of equilibrium back in 2007, maybe there risk-free, just do it. But where I want to get, I can't get there risk-free. I better take some risk. But I need to understand that I'm really taking risk. And I need to understand that the amount of risk I'm taking is such that if I have a bad outcome, I'm not going to be happy. Don't misunderstand me. If I lose money, I'm not going to be happy. Whether or not I understand why I lost money. But if I understand it and I say to myself, I took a risk, I understood why. After the fact, I understand why I lost my money. It was because what I knew could happen. And I made the decision to do it because it gave me a chance to get somewhere I couldn't get otherwise. And then I asked myself the question, after I lost my money, what will I do with the rest of my money? If the answer is the same as before, he keeps my money to manage. I'm not happy, but he's the one man because I'm going to make the same decision. There's no reason to change my decision. One way to do that is to tell me what you're going to do, and then afterwards, when we have a review, show me you did what you told me you would do. And you don't tell me you can do things that you can't. Because if you tell me things what they found a manager who could do better than the index funds, they trusted them because you couldn't do it. So what caused this big shift? The active money didn't do any worse in the crisis than the passive money. Yes, there are people talking about it, but there was nothing to cause that to happen in terms of performance or anything else. But what did happen was a huge loss of trust. So, suppose that you believe that active money could do better. You had your money there. But now you lose the trust. I lose my trust in him, I can't give my money to him anymore. And if I lost my trust in all active managers, I can't give it to an active manager. But I still have to invest my money, right? So what do I look for? I look for something that doesn't require trust. Warren Buffett said that if his widow invested in indexes, she'd do all right. Not that he believes that's the best, but the beauty is she wouldn't have to trust. So my hypothesis, doesn't mean it's true, unless you do your research and show it. My hypothesis is that loss of trust caused people to take a second best answer, conditional that they didn't trust anymore. And that's where the flow came. Now, whether or not that's true, the point I want to make is, if it is, we have very big evidence here of the huge impact on investing from loss of trust. And that's I think what I wanted to show you. That's the bad news, is if we lost the trust, this is a big impact. What's the good news? If you can figure out a way to restore trust, you can have a big impact. Move it back. Find a way to convince me to trust you again, you can have a big impact. So I wanted to show you some hard data to at least think about the importance of trust in the real world of many of the most important things. Okay, now, how much time do I have here left? About 10 minutes. 10 minutes? Okay. They both put up 10, so I guess it's okay. So I have here some observation on trust and financial advice. The first one is, he and I are not, you're my advisor, remember, he and I are not in conflict. I want to hire him and I want to keep him hired. I don't want to fire him. Finding a good advisor is hard. It's a lot of work for me. So if I could find a good advisor and stay with him, I'm very happy. And he, of course, wants to keep me as a customer because that's his living. So both of us want to stay together. We're not in a conflict that way. Now, we have other conflicts, if he has other conflicts with me, but the point is, I just remind you, we're both wanting the same thing, to stay married in that role. The second thing is, however, there's a point where the performance, remember I showed you those numbers, get to the point, a threshold, where I'm going to leave him. You know, I keep there 5 years, 2 years, whatever, 6 years, I eventually got to leave. The third point is that there's a positive trade-off of the threshold and the degree of trust. The more I trust someone, think what trust is. Trust is, even if you see something you don't like, if you really trust, you say there's a good reason for it. You don't say they did something wrong. That's what it means to be trusted. So the more trust you have, the more threshold you have. I'm less likely to leave him the more I trust him. So we're trying to show you the benefits of building this for both parties. Okay? Greater trust, higher threshold. Now, transparency doesn't create trust, but it's a substitute. I showed you that. You don't need trust in this trade. So if you can increase transparency, even though you can't get full transparency, you can raise the threshold. So transparency is a good idea too. Having people understand what you're doing is very helpful in getting them to continue to stay with you because they can see what's going on. So you want to do that. And then our policy of teaching your client, him teaching me, to understand not the investment process or anything. I'm not going to understand. That's why I hired him. I don't do that stuff. No, I don't want him to educate me on risk return or how much Thai real estate I want, or, risk return frontiers or whatever. I just want to have him say, look, this is what we're putting in strategies to try to achieve these objectives, but you need to understand we're taking risk. Why are we taking risk? Because we're going to try to get you somewhere you can't get without taking risk. If I can work. Now, crises. Crises always involve the client, me, losing lots of money. But not every time you lose a lot of money is a crisis. The difference is, okay, that if I knew why I've lost the money, and I don't like it, but I understand it, it's not a crisis. A crisis occurs when I lose a lot of money and I no longer trust what I was doing, either my advisor or the strategy. I feel that all the things I thought I understood were wrong, but I don't know what's right. That's panic, because you have no anchors. This is when people do very extreme things, usually not good things for themselves. Okay? So crisis is when the rules of the game you think have changed. So not only have you lost a lot of money, but whatever you were doing is not something you trust doing anymore, but you don't know what to do. And so you panic. It's a natural phenomenon. So if you do it right, he can take me through a crisis in the sense of a big loss, and I will come out of it not happy, but I'll come out of it intact. It will not be a crisis for me, just I lost a lot of money. And those are different, behaviorally and in terms of actions taken. So this is the sort of thing you can do. A consistent strategy, so forth. I'm not going to go through the paths of error. I think I've talked to you enough already. We're at the end of the 10 minutes they gave me is I'm sure gone. And I know it's easier for me to stand up here and talk to you than for you to have to sit there and listen all this time. But let me summarize by saying, what's the story on financial technology and fintech and trust? The answer is, great opportunities. We're going to do wonderful things for society. And if we're very smart and we actually don't follow best practice, but bring practice that hasn't been done in, not as an experiment, but you know how to do it, it's proven, it's just never been done before, you'll leapfrog. So countries and companies can use technology when they rebuild or redesign their system to jump ahead of all their competition, whether it's the other countries or other companies. So you can come out way ahead. And that's going to happen. How is it happen? I've laid out some different ways, but in the end, it's going to happen. And that's the good news. The second part is the important role of trust in certain areas. Not all areas. We've been through that. But in certain very important areas. So it's going to be harder for robo-advisors who just tell you put your money a certain way to gather traction than it is to be in the payment system or to be in processing or other aspects of financial services. So be selective in understanding where you're operating and where trust is going to be important. Okay? So on that note of summary, I thank you very much for spending your afternoon with me. I hope you found something here of help or interest to you. I never come to tell people what they should do. It doesn't do any good. You're going to do what you decide anyway. No decision maker is just going to listen to me. It has to make sense to them. And just so here, I came to show you things. I hope you saw something that maybe, if not gave you an answer, stimulates you to think about another way of looking at this world of technology and transformation. And I really hope a better world for our society. Thank you. Thank you.
That was a really enlightening and eye-opening lecture. Thank you so much. 질문 있으신 분?
말에는 수위가 있고 수위에는 책임이 따른다고 생각합니다. 첫 번째 질문은 1998년 9월 롱템 캐피탈 매니먼트 사태 이전인 1994년 존 웨더의 LTCM 설립 제의를 받으신 건지, 안 그러면 직접 뭐 다른 분들이 이렇게 제의를 하신 건지 그에 대해서 한번 묻고 싶고요. 두 번째는 지금 다시 시간을 돌려서 LTCM의 파트너 제의를 받으신다면 그게 하실 건지. 마지막으로 세 번째 질문은 인공지능 AI를 통한 자산의 상대가치 차익 거래 투자에 대한 교수님의 생각은 어떠신지에 대해서 여쭤보고 싶습니다.
Well, that's a wide-ranging set of questions. A lot of long-term capital. I was one of the co-founders of the fund. There were several. Some were my former students who had worked at Solomon Brothers and so forth. So I had planned to be a founding partner, but I helped them build it. And then they asked me if I'd like to be there, and I said, sure. Would I do it again? I've been doing it again. I had enough of doing hedge funds. I bought my first share of stock when I was 10 years old. I did my first risk arb, as now they call it, when I was 15. But after a period of time, I moved on to other areas of finance. But if you say, am I going to be in finance practice using technology and markets? Absolutely. The long-term capital story is a complicated one, but basically we were a financial intermediary. But we could spend hours on this. We lost a lot of money, our money. We didn't lose much money for anyone else. Most everybody else made money, but we made mistakes. But there was nothing, other than it was not a great experience. I don't recommend it. But the fact that you make mistakes and you learn from them, and I learned some things, doesn't mean, oh no, I never do something again. Of course I would. That's what I do for a living. I mean, you take risks, and you have to be aware of what they are. And when they happen, you have to take responsibility for them, that's for sure. So I'm not recommending it, But I'm saying that's about it on that. I mean, I don't know what else you want me to answer on that, but you know, we wouldn't, for example, we were never sued by anybody. Now, the reason I say that, the amounts of money involved, you would have thought there were suits all over. This reminds me.
Sorry. Actually, it's a great honor for me to sit in front here to have a lecture. Thank you for your lecture. Actually, my major is not finance and technology. Actually, I run business for students. And what I'm here is, what is most impressed is trust and technology. How much trust can I put, to investor who run a business with my money? Trust is different depending on the person. Measuring trust is different for everyone. So I just...
Yes? Good. All right. So we start, and I should tell you about my slides. I'm not a slide person. I'm not very skillful moving slides back and forth. The slides are for you. If you hear something this afternoon that you find of interest, then they're to remind you what it is that you thought was interesting when you look up them later. So that's what these slides are for. So I hope you all have copies and pick them up. My opening slide is it's a timeline from the 12th century of financial innovation. And I remind you, financial innovation is the means by which the financial system improves and changes, and in so doing, adds to society. So innovation is the process of improving the financial system. I also remind you that this is a place, but I drive rather fast. So when I'm in my home state of Massachusetts and I'm on the turnpike, I'm driving my car and I'm looking in the rearview mirror to see if anybody might interfere with my travel because I'm going very fast. And I suddenly realized I've been driving my car at 30 meters a second looking in the rearview mirror. Now, when does that work? Well, if what's behind me and what's in front of me is the same, it works. The mirror shows me the back, but that's also where I'm going. But what if there's a change in front of me? Then looking in the rearview mirror is a disaster. That's my metaphor for you with this picture. This reminds me.
Sorry. Actually, it's a great honor for me to sit in front here to have a lecture. Thank you for your lecture. Actually, my major is not finance and technology. Actually, I run business for students. And what I'm here is, what is most impressed is trust and technology. How much trust can I put, to investor who run a business with my money? Trust is different depending on the person. Measuring trust is different for everyone. So I just want to...
Well, okay, I think I understand. As I tried to indicate, there's, of course, varying degrees of trust. There are some limits, where you just say, not enough trust, and that's it. So it depends what they're doing for you. It depends on the penalty if they're wrong, or either because they're incompetent or because they have other agendas. Remember, there's two parts to the trust. So the answer is, the more trust you have, the more things you can do, the more you're willing to do it, fine. But, if you have less, you'll do less. I don't know either way. I do point out that trust is scalable. In other words, if he's my advisor and I have him because of trust, if he asks me, do you have someone I can trust? I need trust too. I say, yeah, I trust him. And then he goes to him and gets him as his client. The fact that he's got him as a client didn't reduce my trust, did it? I have just as much trust with him whether or not my client goes, my friend goes. So it's scalable. Whereas the reason I went to him is he gives me good IPOs. You know, he gets me stock that I can at a low price and I can sell it out and make some good money. I'm never bringing my friend because he'll share my IPOs with him. I'll get less. Trust is very scalable when you have it. That I can point out. But beyond that, you know, how do you know you have trust? Well, there's lots of elements to it. I've tried to outline a few of it today. But, you know, it is an organized thing to do. This isn't just saying ether. That's why I tried to show business models that engender trust, things that you can do to better get more trust from people. It's never for free. Trust is always has a cost. I can't cheat you and still have your trust. So I have to do things. He doesn't take money from anyone else. He doesn't take commissions. He doesn't take Rolex watches. He has to pay his own way. Why does he do that? Because he wants to convince me by incurring a cost of not getting the watches, a cost of not getting the commissions, the cost to prove to me as a costly signal that I should trust him. So I don't know if that answers your question, but that's as close as I can come, I think, to answering what you were asking. That it's in trust. So yeah.
Thank you so much. 여러분 박수 한번.
Thank you. Yes? Good. All right. So we start, and I should tell you about my slides. I'm not a slide person. I'm not very skillful moving slides back and forth. The slides are for you. If you hear something this afternoon that you find of interest, then they're to remind you what it is that you thought was interesting when you look up it later. So that's what these slides are for. So I hope you all have copies to pick them up. My opening slide is it's a timeline from the 12th century of financial innovation. And I remind you, financial innovation is the means by which the financial system improves and changes, and in so doing adds to society. So innovation is the process of improving the financial system. I also remind you that this is a place... Yes? Good. All right. So we start, and I should tell you about my slides. I'm not a slide person. I'm not very skillful moving slides back and forth. The slides are for you. If you hear something this afternoon that you find of interest, then they're to remind you what it is that you thought was interesting when you look up it later. So that's what these slides are for. So I hope you all have copies to pick them up. My opening slide is it's a timeline from the 12th century of financial innovation. And I remind you, financial innovation is the means by which the financial system improves and changes, and in so doing adds to society. So innovation is the process of improving the financial system. I also remind you that this is a place, but I drive rather fast. So when I'm in my home state of Massachusetts and I'm on the turnpike, I'm driving my car and I'm looking in the rearview mirror to see if anybody might interfere with my travel because I'm going very fast. And I suddenly realized I've been driving my car at 30 meters a second looking in the rearview mirror. Now, when does that work? Well, if what's behind me and what's in front of me is the same, it works. The mirror shows me the back, but that's also where I'm going. there's a change in front of me. Then looking in the rearview mirror is a disaster. That's my metaphor for you with this picture into the finance scheme. First of all, it's not new. I had the good fortune to be involved in innovation and bringing computers and big data and mathematical models into the mainstream of practice over the last half century. So in that sense, nothing of course of the levels of speed we have now, but we've been doing fintech for a long time. That doesn't diminish its importance or impact, but it also means this is not something that we've never seen before. So we do know something about it, we have some experiences. My view of fintech is I'm very optimistic. I think by bringing the technology properly, price for option pricing. The best option pricing model is different depending what you're trying to do with it. If you're trying to solve as a high frequency trader of options, probably the best model is what's called the stat-arc model, where you're doing things in micro or milliseconds, okay? Structural models do nothing. If you're doing something like convertible bonds or something, maybe one of the big banks' best proprietary model with all the bells and whistles of the modern times will be best. And if you're in accounting and you're trying to write a model for expensing compensatory employee stock options, actually it turns out the best model is a simple Black-Scholes model. So depending on what you're trying to do, what model, the model for the same thing is different. So there's no such thing as the model, okay? Sufficiently statistically significant conclusion that he's either a good manager or not. Now, when I say it that way, you can think of another area. When you do drug discovery and you do clinical trials, you see how the drug does. You set a standard of significance, statistical significance, that you have to do better than in order to have the drug approved. This is the same idea. In other words, significance means to a precision, no one knows for sure, but to a precision of probability that you are willing to say is significant. So you understand my question. How long would it take? Now, I picked a t-statistic of 2. If you don't know what that means, don't worry about it. It's basically, it's a probability of 95%. That's a very low bar. You'll get no drug approved with a t-statistic of. We see that trust is essential for this part of fintech to succeed. And then I want to point you out another thing. Usually when you say trust, most of us think of trustworthy. That person's going to do the right thing for you. Well, with my grown children, I would trust them to make decisions about my life if I can. They can make it for me. Maybe I shouldn't, but I do. But I wouldn't trust any of them with a scalpel to fix my knee. Because I'm trustworthy, yes, but they're totally incompetent. They wouldn't know what to do with that scalpel. So I remind you that trust requires 2 components. Trustworthy and competence. You need to show both to get trust. Okay? And we'll build on that.